At 11 o'clock at night on July 4th, someone called the Coast Guard and said a young man was missing on an island. The Coast Guard said that was not their problem. 13 hours later, they launched a helicopter. That is not a summary. That is not a dramatic framing. That is the confirmed, corrected, official timeline released by the United States Coast Guard in the last few days. And it might be the most disturbing single fact in the entire Nolan Wells case, because everything else in this story, the autopsy questions, the internet chaos, the arrests, the threats, all of it happened after Nolan Wells was already dead. But this 13-hour gap, this is the window where the question is not what happened to him. The question is whether he could have been saved. Let me walk you through the timeline as it has now been officially confirmed. On Saturday, July 4th, 2026, Nolan Wells was on Horn Island with friends. Horn Island is a barrier island off the coast of Mississippi. It is part of the Gulf Islands National Seashore. It is uninhabited. There is no infrastructure, no buildings, no cell service in most areas, no food, no fresh water. You get there by boat. It is hot in July. The Gulf water is warm, the island is narrow and long, surrounded by the Mississippi Sound on one side and the open Gulf of Mexico on the other. It is beautiful and it is isolated. At some point during that day, Nolan became separated from his group. The details of how and why are still in dispute. What is not in dispute is this. At approximately 11 p.m. on Saturday night, a friend of Nolan Wells contacted the United States Coast Guard. The friend said Nolan was missing. The Coast Guard received this call, they assessed it, and they determined that it did not require Coast Guard assistance. Read that again. A friend calls the Coast Guard at 11 at night and says someone is missing on a barrier island. An 18-year-old, alone, in the dark, on an island with no infrastructure. And the response from the Coast Guard is that this does not require their assistance. Not that they are on their way, not that they are monitoring the situation, not that they are coordinating with local authorities. The call did not require Coast Guard assistance. That is the phrase. That is what the Coast Guard itself confirmed in its timeline correction. Now fast forward, the formal request for assistance from the Jackson County Sheriff's Department did not come until 12:26 p.m. on Sunday, July 5th. Let me do the math for you. 11 p.m. Saturday to 12:26 p.m. Sunday. That is 13 hours and 26 minutes. 13 hours and 26 minutes between the moment someone first told the Coast Guard that a teenager was missing on an island and the moment an organized search response was formally initiated. What happened in those 13 hours? We do not know. That is the gap. That is the void at the center of this case. For 13 hours, there was no helicopter. There was no urgent marine information broadcast. There was no coordinated search. There was no Coast Guard vessel. There was nothing. A teenager was missing on a barrier island in the Gulf of Mexico, and for 13 hours, the response was silence. Now here is what happened once the formal request was made. At 12:26 p.m. on Sunday, the Jackson County Sheriff's Department contacted the Coast Guard and requested assistance. The Coast Guard responded immediately. They issued an urgent marine information broadcast, which is a marine radio alert sent to all vessels in the area asking boaters to be on the lookout. And they launched an MH-65 Dolphin helicopter. Within minutes of the formal request, the Coast Guard was in the air. They were searching. They were doing exactly what they are trained to do. So the Coast Guard can respond. They proved that. When the formal request came in, they moved fast. The question is not whether the Coast Guard is capable of responding. The question is why a call at 11 p.m. the night before, a call reporting a missing person on an island, was assessed as not requiring their assistance. What was said in that call? How was the situation described? Who made the assessment? What criteria were used? We do not have answers to any of these questions. The Coast Guard issued this timeline correction formally. They confirmed the 11 p.m. call happened. They confirmed their determination that it did not require assistance. They confirmed the 13-hour gap. They confirmed the 12:26 p.m. formal request. And they confirmed their immediate response to that request. This is not leaked information. This is not a rumor. This is the Coast Guard's own official statement correcting and clarifying the timeline of their involvement. Now, I want you to think about what 13 hours means on Horn Island in July. The island is about 14 miles long and less than a mile wide. The terrain is a mix of beach, dunes, and maritime forest. In the daytime, the heat index can exceed 110 degrees. At night, it does not cool down much. There are insects, snakes, and other wildlife. There is no fresh water on the island. If you are stranded there without supplies, the clock is not your friend. Heat exposure, dehydration, and exhaustion can set in quickly, especially for someone who has already been physically active during the day. Nolan Wells was 18 years old. He was reportedly without his phone. He had left it behind, according to accounts, to keep it out of the ocean, so he had no way to call for help. He had no way to signal anyone. He was on an island in the dark, and the only person who called for him was told that the call did not require assistance. Nolan's body was found in the water on July 6th. The timeline from the 11 p.m. call on July 4th to the discovery of his body on July 6th spans roughly 34 to 36 hours. The formal search did not begin until 13 hours into that window, which means for more than a third of the time between when he was reported missing and when he was found, there was no organized search at all. I am not going to tell you that Nolan Wells would have survived if the Coast Guard had launched at 11 p.m. I do not know that. No one knows that. What I'm going to tell you is that the window in which survival was possible, whatever the size of that window was, shrank by 13 hours because no one went looking. And that is a fact that the Coast Guard has confirmed. It is not a theory. It is not an accusation. It is the documented timeline. Here is the thing that makes this even harder to sit with. The friend who called at 11 p.m. did what you are supposed to do. When someone is missing, you call the authorities. You call the Coast Guard when it involves the water. You report it. That friend did everything right. They picked up a phone at 11 at night and said, "My friend is missing on an island, please help." And the system that is supposed to respond to that call looked at it and said, "This does not meet our threshold for assistance." What threshold? What is the threshold for a missing person on a barrier island at night? What would have had to be different about that call for the Coast Guard to say, "Yes, we are going out there"? Was it the way the situation was described? Was it a jurisdictional question? Was it a resource question? Was it someone's judgment call at 11 p.m. on a Saturday night? The Coast Guard's timeline correction does not answer these questions. It simply confirms the facts. The call happened, the determination was made, the gap is real. The Jackson County Sheriff's Department is the agency that ultimately made the formal request at 12:26 p.m. on Sunday. So between the 11 p.m. call to the Coast Guard and the 12:26 p.m. request from the Sheriff's Department, there is a chain of communication that we do not fully understand. Did the Sheriff's Department know about the 11 p.m. call? Were they contacted separately? Was there a delay in the family or friends contacting the sheriff? Or was the Sheriff's Department aware and making their own assessment during those hours? These are questions that have not been answered. What we know is this. The Coast Guard says a friend called at 11 p.m. The Coast Guard says they determined it did not require their assistance. The Sheriff's Department made the formal request at 12:26 p.m. the next day. The Coast Guard launched immediately after that request, and Nolan Wells was found dead in the water the day after that. For the family, this timeline correction is devastating because it confirms something they probably suspected but could not prove, that there was a delay, that the system did not move when it should have, that someone, somewhere, made a decision in the middle of the night that their son's disappearance was not urgent enough to warrant a response. And by the time the system did move, by the time the helicopter was in the air, by the time the broadcast went out, 13 hours had passed. 13 hours in which their son was alone on an island or in the water or somewhere in between, and no one was looking for him. Nolan's mother, Christine Wansley, has been fighting for answers since the moment her son did not come home. She is a nurse. She works in a profession where seconds matter, where the difference between life and death is measured in minutes, where response time is everything. And now she knows that the response to her son's disappearance was delayed by 13 hours. Not because the Coast Guard could not respond, they proved they could, but because someone decided the first call did not warrant it. The Coast Guard launched within minutes of the formal request. Think about that. When they were asked, they moved fast. The MH-65 Dolphin helicopter was in the air. The urgent marine information broadcast was issued. Every vessel in the area was alerted. The machine worked exactly as it is supposed to work once it was activated. The problem is not the machine. The problem is that the machine was not activated 13 hours earlier. This case has many layers. There are questions about the autopsy. There are questions about the evidence. There are questions about what happened on the island. There are questions about the friends who were there. There are questions about the internet chaos that has consumed the narrative. But underneath all of those questions is this one: A simple, terrible, unavoidable question. If the search had started at 11 p.m. instead of 12:26 p.m. the next day, would Nolan Wells be alive today? No one can answer that question with certainty. But the fact that it can be asked, that it must be asked, is the reason this timeline correction matters more than any other development in this case. Because every other development is about what happened after Nolan Wells died. This one is about the window in which he might not have. A friend called at 11 p.m. on July 4th and said a teenager was missing on an island. The Coast Guard said it did not require their assistance. 13 hours and 26 minutes later, the formal request came in. The helicopter launched. The broadcast went out. The search began. And somewhere in those 13 hours, in the dark, on the water, on the island, alone, without a phone, without anyone looking for him, an 18-year-old boy's window closed. The Coast Guard has confirmed this timeline. The question now is whether anyone will be held accountable for the decision that was made at 11 p.m. on a Saturday night. The decision that a missing teenager on a barrier island did not require assistance. The decision that may have cost Nolan Wells his life. There is one more piece of context that makes this timeline even more damning. Horn Island is not a mystery to the Coast Guard. It is not an unfamiliar location. The Coast Guard patrols the waters around the Gulf Islands National Seashore regularly. They know the island, they know the currents, they know how a person can go missing there and what happens to a body in that water. They have the maps, they have the training, they have the equipment. The infrastructure to respond was in place. The only thing missing at 11 p.m. on July 4th was the decision to use it. And that decision, whoever made it, is now the subject of scrutiny that will not go away. Every family member of Nolan Wells, every attorney working on this case, every reporter covering it, every citizen following it will ask the same question. Why not? Why did the call not require Coast Guard assistance? Who decided that? On what basis? Under what protocol? With what information? The Coast Guard has confirmed the timeline. What they have not yet explained is the reasoning, and until they explain the reasoning, the 13-hour gap will remain the most haunting fact in a case full of haunting facts. The formal request came at 12:26 p.m. The helicopter went up, the broadcast went out, the search began. And for the family of Nolan Wells, every second of those 13 hours that passed before that moment is a second they will never get back, and a second their son will never get back either.